The Retreat, written and read by Christopher Halton. Having returned home from India, where I served a commission in the 1st Regiment of Bengal Lancers, I was still recovering from the effects of malaria, which I had contracted there. After 12 years in India, I eagerly anticipated the cooler English air and the promise of a tranquil life in Suffolk. Daily struggles were the constant flies, excessive heat, poor sanitation, and debilitated water quality. But the prospect of the peaceful English countryside, with its cooler air and serene landscapes, filled me with hope and a sense of relief for the future. My main interest in life was not just a passing fancy, but a long-cherished dream. The thought of owning a small farm with a few hundred acres, a place where I could settle down and start my own family at the age of 35, had been a constant source of inspiration and determination for me. I had dreamed and savoured it for several years, and with a small annuity from a late relative, I knew I could live reasonably comfortably. My ancestors, the Willards, were historically landowners and farmers, and I as a youth acquired great knowledge in such matters from my Uncle James, who sadly passed away some 5 years ago while I was serving abroad in the service of Her Majesty. This connection to the land was not just a passing interest, but a deeply ingrained part of me, shaping my aspirations and guiding my decisions. Sir Richard Thompson Smythe, a close friend of my youth, kindly allowed me to use a cottage on his estate. The cottage was some miles distant from the village of Clare in Suffolk, bordering the Stours river banks. As he described it, it was an idyllic location, with a long, sloping garden fringed with weeping willows along the river edge. The mere thought of living in such a picturesque setting filled me with excitement and anticipation. Here he assured me that I could live in contemplative peace without a care for the world, and hopefully recover from the maladies of living previously in such a hostile climate. I graciously accepted his offer and arrived one morning in June 1889 by hansom cab from Clare railway station. Having tipped the driver after offloading my luggage, he tugged the brim of his hat and left. After he had gone, I stood silently and inhaled the clean-tasting air. How heavenly, I mused, as the day was warm and sunny, with no clouds in the sky. But that brief sojourn in time was swiftly broken by the arrival of a small gig. From it stepped a very self-important-looking man who walked over to me. Having outstretched his right hand, we both shook, and he said, "Are you James Willard, sir?" Having replied in the affirmative, he identified himself as the land agent from the estate, who had been sent at Sir Richard's behest to hand me the keys to the property. This punctilious character, wearing a grey bespoke three-piece suit, winged shirt and tie, and matching bowler hat, identified himself as John Masters, a diminutive fellow in his early 40s, afflicted with an unusual nervous tic that caused his left eye to twitch or blink a lot. Aside from the tic, his appearance was cold, framed with a relatively austere thin face, a short but perfectly trimmed moustache, and a sharp nose upon which a pair of round horn-rimmed glasses was perched. Unquestionably he knew of his tic, which may have explained his somewhat officiously polite demeanour. He said, "Sir Richard has instructed me to offer his most sincere apologies, as the usual housekeeper afforded for guests here has been taken ill, unfortunately. However, he is arranging for a relief housekeeper to arrive tomorrow morning. The house is in good order, having been left clean with sufficient food to tide you until she arrives." Having passed me the keys after finishing his speech, he grimaced an attempt at a smile and bade me goodbye. With that, he returned to the waiting gig and was gone. This man certainly didn't inspire a friendly welcome with any degree of hospitality. Still carrying my 2 cases, I dismissed any further thoughts of him as I opened a white picket gate and entered the property's front garden path. At this point, I had yet to see the house, as a neatly trimmed privet hedge sealed the front from public gaze. Behind it stood several ornamental trees and shrubs that prohibited viewing the actual house. Despite that, it was a pleasant enticement for me to discover what lay beyond this mantle of greenery. and the gentle curving gravel path that sinuously disappeared into the trees and shrubbery piqued my interest. Following this hidden trail, I soon saw the appearance of a fine 16th century mellow brick yeoman's cottage with white sash windows and stone window sills, organically framed with black wooden studwork. The front entrance had a delightfully tiled brick porch, whose open canopy revealed a fine late Georgian black-painted wooden door that felt warm and welcoming. The beauty of the cottage, with its charming details and inviting atmosphere, filled me with a sense of wonder and admiration. It was as if the cottage welcomed me with open arms, promising to be a place of peace and comfort after the tumultuous years in India. I could hardly contain my excitement as I approached the door, eager to step inside and make it my own. Everything about this house exuded warmth and the feeling of gentle contentment with itself. Having unpacked my cases in the master bedroom and placed my belongings in an armoire and matching chest of mahogany drawers, I relaxed briefly on a comfy but firm brass headboard bed. From there I could hear outside the gentle dalliances of nature, with chirping birds and, in the distance, the flow of the river Stour, which, as I had discovered later, had a small weir with cascading water. All in all, it was perfectly harmonized, and I could not wish for a better place to recuperate from the arduous climes of India. Having made lunch in the kitchen from a fresh loaf of bread in a white enamel bread bin, I sliced some cheese, which I partook with a glass of beer while seated in a garden seat, under the shade of a magnificent magnolia tree. Later that evening I relaxed in the front lounge, listening to Jenny Lind's dulcet tones on a 78 RPM record played on a wind-up gramophone. With its wainscoted walls and Bessemer fireplace, this room exuded all I loved and missed for many years of home. Seldom had I felt as comfortable in body and spirit as within this architectural jewel, and I was so thankful to my friend Richard that I raised a toast of a glass of brandy before retiring to bed. During the night I was aroused by what I dreamily thought was the sound of footsteps on the landing outside. I was sure someone was inside the house, but I had to remind myself that all downstairs windows and doors were bolted or locked. Lighting a candle, for there was no gas or electricity in the house, I, with some trepidation, opened the door and stepped on the landing. There was nobody there, yet the creaking sound of footsteps persisted, albeit briefly, and stopped altogether. I called out, for there was no reply, and I told this unseen intruder that I was armed and would shoot if whoever was there failed to step forward. Of course, nobody came. I then checked all the rooms, which included the downstairs lounge, rear sitting room, study and storeroom, but there was no sign of anyone else in the house. By now I felt more relaxed and assumed the sounds were mice or similar between the floorboards, and I returned to my room. After some effort, I soon fell asleep until the advent of dawn, which was heralded exuberantly by the chattering of excited birds in the morning mist. I bathed, dressed, and ate a hearty breakfast before stepping outside and exploring the length and breadth of this hallowed property. By now, the mist which had earlier crept up from the river was burned away by the brightness of a sunny day, and I sat in a contemplative mood by the river bank, watching the swirls of fish in the water, which I presumed were gathering for breadcrumbs. In that morning light, the weir displayed all the vibrancy of a rainbow as the sun reflected its bright rays into the falling comb of water. Sitting here for some minutes also attracted the curiosity of two beautiful swans who frolicked in the water and moved closer, as I suspected, for food and attention. Just then I heard a woman's voice faintly from the direction of the house. As I returned, I could hear with certainty that a female visitor was calling my name. I went through the house and opened the entrance door. A rather slim and attractive lady in her late 30s stood in a brown ankle-length skirt and a matching bodice with long sleeves adorned with lace. She had auburn hair tied neatly in a bun and flashing blue eyes that gave her an allure of vibrancy. She wasn't quite the woman I had expected, and I sensed an air of dignity and good bearing around her. Next to her and resting on the ground was a large leather portmanteau, which I discovered later had been brought to the door by a handsome cab driver who had departed in the minutes it took me to travel up the garden to answer the door. Smiling, she said with a good voice that suggested an educated background, "Are you the gentleman requiring my services?" I excitedly replied, "Why, yes, of course, my name is James, and you?" "Alice Biddle, sir, your new housekeeper." Struggling with her heavy bag, I invited her inside and carried it upstairs to the spare bedroom overlooking the rear garden. Placing it on the floor next to a dressing table, she breathed a sigh of relief, stretched her arms and smiled. "It's been a long journey getting here, sir, but I am very pleased to be here and to make your acquaintance. If you permit me an hour, I will get myself organized and will see you downstairs, sir." As I was leaving, I said, "I am quite informal. You may address me as James if I am permitted to call you Alice." Her face lit up and she said, "That will be perfectly fine with me, sir." She giggled in a soft feminine way and continued, "Oh, sorry, James, thank you." After leaving her and feeling even more elated by Alice's presence, I went to the study to write a letter to Richard thanking him for her being here. That evening, Alice prepared a salad with slices of smoked beef that she found in the kitchen's cool box. It was an excellent meal, and while eating, Alice reorganized the kitchen and examined the walk-in larder to check the availability of dried food in storage. She later reported that she would need to travel to a very local neighbouring farm owned by Sir Richard, where she could replenish the larder on his instruction. I was perfectly agreeable to that, and later that evening I invited her to sit with me in the lounge, which she readily accepted, where she chatted with me whilst knitting under the illumination of 2 oil lamps. "Tell me, Alice, you strike me as an educated woman, and I suspect you have a good family background." "Well," she said, relaxing in a large leather club chair, "I was privately educated at the Dulwich Girls' School, London. My father was a diplomat who spent many years abroad, so I stayed with an aunt during my formative years there. Why is a lady of quality such as yourself working as a housekeeper?" Her face briefly lost the radiance of her smile, and she appeared troubled by my question. But after a brief pause she replied, "I made a terrible choice in my youth and married a man who transpired to be a violent drunken blackguard. I find it difficult to talk about this, but my family cut all contact with me, and I was forced to live in reduced circumstances. For some years after our divorce, I was constantly on the move to avoid him. He would not let me go." Suddenly her face brightened and she concluded, "But that is all in the past, James, and I am happier and more settled in my life." She explained that her family were well-to-do devout Catholics, and despite her ex-husband's violence, divorce was considered to be a sin, and on that premise they disowned her. I felt terribly sad for her, but she assured me everything was now fine and that I should not concern myself. For the next few days, my friendship with Alice became closer and much more meaningful, and with her housekeeping, I felt very comfortably at home here. Some evenings we would sit by the riverbank discussing and enjoying each other's company. We both felt mutually attached, and I sensed that our friendship was evolving deeper and more meaningful. But for then, we kept it relatively professional. One day in July, on another bright sunny morning, I worked with Richard's employee, a farm labourer named Jennings, to tidy up the heavily shrubbed front garden and trim the hedge. While Jennings, a young, quiet man in his 20s, was using a hand scythe in the garden, I stood outside trimming the hedge with a pair of shears. The road outside was generally very quiet regarding any form of traffic. I found it unusual to see a man in his late 30s standing opposite me in the shade of a horse chestnut tree, staring at me with an apparent disdain for my presence. I saw immediately that one hand held the bowl of a smoking clay pipe in his mouth, while his attire consisted of a raggedy wide-brimmed black hat with a matching dark coat and trousers, and appeared heavily built like a labourer. His face was long, unshaven, and rough-looking like dark-tanned leather, and his eyes were piercing from within the dark brow of his hat. I smiled and said, "Good morning." But he remained motionless and unmoved while he continued to look at me with utter contempt, which I felt deserved a response. I then put down the shears as I turned my back towards him, but upon facing him again, I saw that he was gone. I wandered over to see whether he had secreted himself behind the large trunk of the chestnut tree, but he was nowhere to be seen. But one thing struck me as odd. The heavy stench of cheap tobacco and the stale smell of beer permeated the air in a very unpleasant manner. I paid no more of my time to this presence and continued with my labours, which were completed in 30 or so minutes. I reported my earlier encounter to Alice later, and she stopped immediately mixing dough in a ceramic basin and stood looking visibly shaken as I described this man. "What's wrong, Alice? Please pray tell me." She appeared confused and picked up a cloth to wipe her hands before attempting to leave the kitchen. I gently grabbed her arm and pulling her towards me, I embraced her and whispered, "Alice, you know this man, don't you?" She held her head close to my chest and said, "You don't want to know." I replied, "Oh, but I do. Who is he, Alice?" She almost spat the words out. "That is my ex-husband, Jeremiah. He is the one who has followed me everywhere. He will not let me go." She burst into tears, and I removed a handkerchief from my pocket and gently wiped around her eyes. She then pulled away from me, and still bereft, she said, "If I stay, I will bring nothing but harm and shame upon you. He is evil and vindictive." In exasperation, I said, "How does he know where you go?" "He always knows, James. I thought he had died from cirrhosis of the liver 10 years ago, but apparently not, because he eventually catches up with me and forces me to flee, and now I must pack and leave." The thought of this remarkable woman leaving me filled me with sadness and dread, for I could not imagine my life without her. I eventually calmed her down and pleaded with her to stay. I decided that we were now entwined as two hearts, and that I would never allow her to leave. Reluctantly, and only because of her affection for me, did she agree to stay. From what she told me, her ex, a man named Jeremiah Brickstone, was reportedly found dead in a hovel apartment in London, having literally drunk himself to death. He never got over her, but regretted his bullying ways, which forced their separation and divorce, which was granted by a court sitting in London. He always swore their marriage was for good and bad, and she would remain his until death. But whose death, I pondered. When I saw him in broad daylight, he looked very much alive and must have secretly followed her to the house. I was convinced only that a confrontation with him would be the best remedy to rid him of our lives. I still retained my service revolver, which I resolved to use should he step inside the threshold. From that moment onwards, I increased the security around the property. I purchased some man-traps, which were perfectly legal to prevent burglars, and placed these accordingly on all exits inside the house. From that moment, I felt it was a question of waiting to see what Brickstone's next move would be, so I stayed up late each evening to ensure her safety in her room by staying awake until 2 a.m. in mine. Over the prevailing weeks, the late hours certainly took their toll on me, but I waited patiently and often very tired for Mr. Brickstone's appearance. On the 28th of July, tiredness must have gotten the better of me when I was suddenly roused from my sleep by the sudden snap of the man-trap placed by the kitchen door, followed by an accompanying animal scream. I rushed downstairs with my revolver cocked and ready to fire when I was shocked to see by moonlight a dead cat caught in the vicious teeth of the trap. This roused Alice from her sleep, and she joined me in the kitchen, where, despite my best efforts, she saw the horrific spectacle lying crushed dead. She screamed, "Oh my God, please, no!" I could see from the light of the lamp she brought with her a message daubed in blood on the kitchen wall, which read, "I will get you, Alice, for you belong to me." Apart from being deeply shocked, I was unquestionably confused. All the house remained secure, and the cat was a feral one that lived in the garden. There was no way for the cat or Brickstone to have entered the property without detection. For the rest of the night, Alice lay with me on my bed, holding me as tightly as she could, for fear of losing me while quietly sobbing until she eventually fell asleep. I remained awake, bleary-eyed until morning light, clutching my revolver. Later that day, I sent word to Sir Richard via a messenger from his nearby farm to accompany me at the house on a matter of the gravest urgency. Despite his issues with running a busy estate, I knew he would attend expectantly, and he arrived later in the afternoon, having ridden in by horse. Sir Richard, who was in his mid-30s, was dressed in a tweed Norfolk jacket, jodhpurs and riding boots. He was slimly built and clean-shaven. He was always a dashing fellow with a sense of bravado, and I knew I could entreat him to help with this situation. Upon seeing me, he placed down his riding whip, warmly embraced me and said, "By Jove, my friend, so pleased to see you. The country air seems to have helped you a great deal, eh, what? And you have this lovely house and Alice's services to boot. So tell me, what could possibly be so grave?" With his permission, I brought Alice into the lounge, where he sat cradling a brandy I had given him. We all sat down, and Alice and I explained the situation to him. At first we were met with incredulity until we finally arrived at the bloody message, a cryptic note written in what appeared to be blood, and the dead cat, its lifeless body arranged in a grotesque manner. He was, quite bluntly, very shocked. "So tell me, dear James, how can I assist you? Whatever is going on here needs to be dealt with jolly well promptly. Where do you think the bounder is now, and how could he have got in?" I replied. "I have no answers at present other than to ask you to help me with 2 favours. "And that is," he replied quizzically, "I wonder if you can use your resources to discover what happened with this fellow Brickstone. Is he still alive? I know that the premise of a dead man haunting us seems so ridiculous to suggest, but we are desperate to confirm that either way, and whether you could supply at least one member of your staff to patrol the grounds for a few hours each night for at least a couple of weeks or so." He mused quietly for a few seconds and smiled. "Yes, I think I can arrange these for you. I will also get John Masters to check the records. I have a source in London who can follow this through, and from tonight I will get young Jenkins to patrol the grounds with a shotgun loaded with buckshot in case this fellow is caught tramping around the garden. I'll ensure he will be here for at least 2 weeks. I cannot say how long it will take to verify records, but be assured it will be done as diligently as possible." As he got up to leave, he said, "One obvious last thought. Have you considered informing the local constabulary in Clare?" I replied that I had, but given the evidence as presented thus, it is doubtful that they would believe us until we have found more credible proof. He agreed and left after thanking me for the brandy and a chance to meet up with a dear friend. That night, with the traps in place, a series of strategically positioned alarms that would sound if anyone trespassed, and Jenkins patrolling the grounds, we both relaxed and settled in our respective rooms for a night's sleep. Jenkins was tasked with remaining until 2 a.m, and in his vigil he was instructed to walk around the property's exterior with a lamp to put off any potential intruders. This seemed like a capital idea. If Brickstone were in the locality, that would be a deterrent. At least, so I thought. At 3 a.m, I was awoken by footsteps creeping around outside my bedroom door, and I felt my heart pump furiously, expecting what might be awaiting me. I carefully opened my bedroom door and saw the silhouette of a man reaching for the handle of Alice's door, which the figure proceeded to turn. I immediately challenged him and saw it was Brickstone, who turned around towards me to attack with both hands outstretched towards my throat. His face displayed a maniacal hatred of a man possessed with a terrible evil. I let loose with one bullet from my revolver, which passed through his chest. Instead of expecting to see his now slumped body, he had disappeared completely. Alice came out immediately after I fired, with a look of abject terror on her face, but when she saw there was nothing other than a bullet in the water closet door, she turned confused towards me and said, "What has happened?" I explained the preceding moments to her, and she exclaimed, "How can this be? He must be a ghost, or you imagine this, James." I plainly did not, and Brickstone's disappearance added a new dimension of horror for someone or something that could not be seemingly stopped. At this point, I almost decided enough was enough, and Alice felt it better to flee again, but realised that running now wasn't an option, as he would inevitably find her or me again. Instead, I asked Richard to double up patrols, with both working until 3 a.m. One was to continue outside, and the other sat on the landing with a lamp from whom I would take over this vigilance until daybreak. Fortunately, Alice was much more stoic than usual and determined to see this through. We worked this shift pattern for 2 weeks, the man-traps were removed, and even the local vicar attended to bless the house, and for a while there was peace. But deep down, I felt a brooding menace pervading the house. As we headed into August, the estate manager, John Masters, called by the house. This time he seemed more pleasant and amenable, and had updates on Brickstone's whereabouts. Excitedly handing me some paperwork, he exclaimed that Brickstone wasn't dead, and was in fact a patient in a medical ward based inside a psychiatric hospital in North London. According to Mr. Masters, Brickstone had been admitted there following a mental breakdown caused primarily by alcoholic poisoning, which followed his divorce some 10 years past. Within days of admission, he collapsed into an alcoholic coma, a state of profound unconsciousness, and has been there in this vegetative state, a lifeless shell, ever since. I was quietly shocked and thanked Masters for his hard work. On leaving, he added that there were no recorded deaths of any Brickstones, which is fortunate as it is such a scarce name. His contact at the hospital promised to inform him if there was any change to his condition. With that, he doffed his hat and left. When I shared this with Alice, her reaction was one of disbelief. How could this be? I've seen him so many times, and he's been physically aggressive towards me. Her shock was evident, adding to the weight of the situation. I was lost for any possible logical explanation. His body is in London, and not Suffolk, and nobody there has reported a man walking out in a comatose state. It simply did not make for any rational explanation. However, I couldn't shake the memory of a sadhu holy man I had encountered in India who could project himself while in a spiritual trance. A coma, I deduced, is not a million miles from being in a trance, and so I believed that with the raging hate he possessed for his ex-wife, he may have used that energy to project a solid physical image to wherever he wanted. This may explain the incidents that have occurred both day and night. This chilled me as it hinted at a supernatural element in Brickstone's condition. I devised a plan should either of us confront this evil menace again. I surmised that in his subconscious state, he enjoyed complete control of his unchallenged emotions and could craft them towards any task or action he wished. It was the inherent fear that he so far thrived upon from Alice and myself's reactions that allowed him to do whatever he wished. To this end, we would prepare ourselves for his next visit, which I hoped would not be too distant. We cancelled our home security, and we sat up patiently in the lounge until 3 a.m. each night to confront this menace on our terms. As the darkness of the night wore on, we waited with bated breath, our suspicions growing that Brickstone was aware of our intentions and had chosen to evade us. But then, like a spectre, he materialized before our eyes at 2 a.m. on a forsaken Sunday morning, his face twisted in a snarl of hatred, his outstretched hands reaching for me like skeletal fingers. I stood my ground, my voice ringing out in defiance. "You don't frighten us, you pitiful washed-up drunk. You're weak, and your physical form lies helpless, unable to harm us." The words struck him like a blow, and he recoiled, his eyes wide with shock, as if he had been caught red-handed in some nefarious scheme. "I'll kill you both," he bellowed. But Alice stood tall, her voice laced with contempt. "You're a coward, a bully who preyed on the weak. But now your body lies wasted, a shadow of its former self, and we're stronger than you'll ever be." I taunted him. "Don't you need a drink to bolster your courage, Jeremiah?" With a flourish, I hurled the brandy from my glass at him, watching as he began to fade, his form wavering like a flame in the wind. I emptied the decanter, spraying him with the amber liquid as he faded further, his presence weakening ever more. "Here's your drink, Jeremiah, but you can't indulge, can you? You're a figment of your imagination, a worthless wastrel that was never any good." Alice's voice cut through the air. "You no longer terrify me, you bully. Leave us be and rot alone, unwanted, in your own body." His scream was like a damned soul being drawn by some dark force that had come to claim him, and in an instant he vanished. We later discovered that at that precise moment Brickstone's comatose body had died suddenly, and a short while after he was removed without comment to the morgue, where later he was cremated with his ashes scattered into the hospital gardens. He was now banished forever into oblivion, and possibly a hell of his own creation. Our lives from this moment forward were united, and within months we married and settled down with our own farm and raised a family. All that we suffered from the cruel ego of Brickstone was a worthwhile sacrifice, and we remained together blissfully happy and for the rest of our days. The end.